How does the RTX 3070 perform in 2023? With 8GB of VRAM, can it stack up in games today? I have a 13 game benchmark lined up in 1440p and 1080p. Please note that I am using DSR for 1440p as I do not own a native 1440p monitor. 1440p DSR should be able to show similar results to native 1440p. I have 4 games in comparison for ray tracing as well. All games will be benchmarked on a 3 game run average and per resolution. So let's get into it. The test system is my own personal rig with a 3700X, 32 gigs of G-Skill Trident DDR4 3200 CL16 single rank memory using XMP, a B550 Aorus Master, and lastly the Zotac RTX 3070 Twin Edge. I have no overclock or tuning on the RAM, the CPU, or the GPU. The 3700X can be limiting in some scenarios, but I will point it out where it is happening. I will also be putting an article out on my website, ystech.org, linked in the description. I will not be using DLSS in this test where possible. NVIDIA low latency will be turned off. If it's turned on, I will let you know in which games. VSync is also off as well. For all the benchmarks, higher is better on the graph. For the first game, we have A Plague Tale Requiem, where I use the scene where you run through the market in the second stage of the game. On the ultra quality settings at 1080p, we get a more than playable game at 72.47 FPS average. On 1440p, we achieve 56.93 FPS on average, making the 1080p average 27% faster on ultra settings. A Plague Tale Requiem also had the GPU at a very high utilization rate, being nearly 98 to 99% on 1440p. A note when the 1% lows, they really aren't great with the system, and this is a pattern with these benchmarks and maybe an issue with the 3700X or RAM keeping up with the RTX 3070. I'd just like to note as well that on 1440p, the game is still playable and is visually a lot sharper than 1080p, as with most of the 1440p benchmarks for the RTX 3070. Next is Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Using the in-game benchmark on ultra settings, the RTX 3070 achieved 95.87 FPS on average, and on 1440p, achieving 83.13 FPS on average. This makes the 1080p run about 15% faster. As with the previous A Plague Tale Requiem experience, the 1% lows on this benchmark show some stutter in the game. In this instance, although 1440p is slower on average, the game is a lot sharper, and in this instance I would definitely recommend to play AC Valhalla on 1440p for the increase in clarity and sharpness, while still being a very fluid experience. Control is an interesting game in 2023 and will be used as one of the ray tracing examples later on. I'm running it on DX12 and with high settings on. For this benchmark, I run around destroying 2 rows of tables and then move on to shooting the guards slightly later. At 1080p, the game performs well at 118.7 FPS average, but a much lower 1% lows at 57.03 FPS average. Some stutter is quite noticeable in the game when the scene shifts to no combat or combat sequences. Comparing 1440p, we got 79.87 FPS on average, making the 1080p average about 49% faster. And on the 1% lows, on 1440p we achieve 55.23 FPS on average, making the 1080p 1% lows about 3% faster. Next is CyberPunk, using the in-game benchmark on Ultra, and will be used as a ray tracing benchmark later on. At 1080p, CyberPunk gets 88.13 FPS, compared to the 1440p 59.1 FPS on average, making the 1080p run about 49% faster than the 1440p run at ultra settings. An important note on this game as well is through the bar scene on both 1080p and 1440p, there is some slight stutter when panning onto the bar countertop, so that's something to keep in mind as well. Fortnite is our first esport title on DX11, with medium-high settings and a far view render distance. Now I could have lowered the settings for a more competitive experience, so you could potentially get more frames if you lower your settings. This is an odd result, with 1440p is 119.2 FPS on average, and the 1% lows at 55.55 FPS, compared to 113.73 average on 1080p, and a similar 1% low of 55.57 FPS on average on the 1% lows. The CPU is likely to be an issue here regarding the results, but I think Fortnite has performed pretty well here, so I'm happy with that. Next is Forza Horizon 5 on ultra settings using the in-game benchmark. At 1080p we got 90.6 FPS on average compared to the 1440p's 64.5 FPS on average, making the 1080p result 40% faster. Now the 1% lows aren't too bad in these runs as well, but could be better at 1080p. The 1% lows average was 63.63 FPS, and on 1440p it was 43.4 FPS for the 1% lows average. Overall, this isn't too bad a result for Forza Horizon 5, and certainly gives a more than playable experience. Grand Theft Auto 5 is up with the in-game benchmark, but only from the waterfall scene, as there is no interruption with loading times with black screens in between them. GTA 5 is on the ultra/very high settings. At 1080p, the RTX 3070 achieves a 90.5 FPS on average, but sadly a low 33.03 FPS on the 1% lows. 1440p has 67.37 FPS on average and 48.73 for the 1% lows average. It's a bit interesting how the 1% lows are 48% better on the 1440p runs, but on average the 1080p benchmark was better by 34%. The 1% lows are a bit concerning and annoying, as when explosions happen the frame rate drops quite a bit, unfortunately. Hogwarts Legacy provides a challenge for the system, and I ran it through the high settings. The benchmark is done through Hogsmeade, running from the bottom entrance to the back pond. This is also one of the games that I will be using for ray tracing later on. Both resolutions provide a similar result here. At 1080p, we achieve 65.2 FPS on average and 62.87 FPS at 1440p, making the 1080p faster by only 4%. Now the 1% lows are pretty horrible at 28.77 for 1440p and 33.87 for 1080p. The stutter is more obvious than other benchmarks and is something I will have to look at with the systems when I redo benchmarks on either a tuned CPU and RAM or better hardware. Next is Horizon Zero Dawn. It was benchmarked on Ultra with the in-game benchmark. This benchmark is relatively smooth at 1080p. The RTX 3070 achieved 105.93 FPS and 97.2 FPS on average on 1440p. This makes the 1080p run about 9% faster on average. The 1% lows are not great, but they're still okay. At 1080p, we got 67.5 FPS, and on 1440p, we got 63.97 FPS on average. This benchmark was relatively smooth on both resolutions, but there is room for improvement on the 1% lows. Next, we have League of Legends as the next esport title. I had just played ARAM games for this benchmark at very high settings. Now the games can range for anywhere from about 15 to 30 minutes for these three benchmarks. At 1440p, it actually outperformed 1080p. 1080p was about 7% slower on average, and on the 1% lows by about 2%. League of Legends is obviously very playable on the system, and there wasn't much noticeable stutter. There can be times in game where large fights break out, so frames can drop, which could explain the 1% lows being nearly half of the average. Another esports title we have here is Overwatch 2. on the low settings, and I played 3 games. Of one of the games was split up into rounds, so I stopped the benchmark before the screen gives the score, and I resumed it once it started again. Again, we likely have a CPU issue here, as the 1440p result got 264.54 FPS on average, and the 1080p result got 225.7 FPS on average, making 1440p 15% faster on average than 1080p. The 1% lows are 138 FPS on average for 1440p and 94.13 FPS for the 1080p 1% lows. Not too bad a result, and the game is running pretty smoothly as well. Ratchet and Clank A Rift Apart is up with medium settings. The benchmark I use for this is the opening parade, where it finishes off after you destroy the ship and Quark and Skid McMarks fly in. This is also one of the games I will be using for the RayTracing benchmark. At 1080p, we achieved 56.47 FPS on average, which is 3% slower than 1440p at 58.17 FPS on average. It's again interesting that we got a slightly higher result on 1440p. The 1% lows at 1080p were 36.3 FPS on average, which is 14% worse than the 42.4 FPS on the 1% lows on 1440p. A note on the gameplay: whilst the majority of the benchmark feels smooth, when combat is done there can be problems with stutter. 1440p looks much better than 1080p for Ratchet and Clank, and is a much more pleasant experience. The stutter could be helped with DL assists, but sacrificing quality, or just tuning up the system. I will have a video comparing quality settings on this game for the RTX 3070 later on. Personally, I believe that Ratchet & Clank A Rift Apart should be played with as high frame rate as possible, as I've personally played this game extensively on PS5 and I'd love to have it running at over 100 FPS. Lastly, for the non-RayTracing titles, and actually our last esport title, is Valorant. I had just played a Spike Rush as I'm pretty washed up at the moment and I wanted to save some time as well. I had my own settings on, so medium/low with NVIDIA low latency on. The full settings will be linked in the article on my website ystech.org. Valorant had a very similar performance at 1440p and 1080p, with 1080p being 2% slower on average. For the 1% lows, they are similar, with 1440p being 90.27 and 1080p being 86.83, on average making 1440p 4% better for the 1% lows. Through this benchmark, Valorant performed well, being a CPU intensive game, and there was little stutter during the games as well. For the rest of this video, I've got the RayTracing results lined up, and then the overall RayTracing and non-RayTracing performance, and then after a price comparison, and lastly some recommendations. The RayTracing results on the graph will show the both non-RayTracing results and the RayTracing ones. You'll be able to see them on the axes as well, denoting non-RayTracing or RayTracing on. For the first RayTracing result, we have Control using the RayTracing High preset. At 1080p RT on, the RTX 3070 achieves 72.93 FPS compared to the 1440p 46.90 FPS, making the 1080p result about 55% faster on average. 1% lows for 1080p are 50.43 FPS and 32.67 FPS on average for the 1440p result. This makes 1080p 1% lows about 54% better on average. Comparing it to the non-RayTracing version, at 1080p the non-RayTracing is about 72% faster on average at 1080p, whilst at 1440p it's about 70% faster on average. With RayTracing on at 1440p, the game is not unplayable, it's just not the best experience. The 1080p result is quite similar to the non-RayTracing 1440p result as well. Personally, if I wanted RayTracing, I would lower my settings and might keep them at 1080p. Although I think that the non-RayTracing 1440p provides a very sharp and playable game in my opinion. Next is CyberPunk with ray tracing at Ultra. At 1080p, ray tracing on the RTX 3070 achieves 43.73 FPS, and at 1440p, it achieves 28.43 FPS on average, making the 1080p result faster by about 44%. With the GPU push, the 1% lows aren't as bad with ray tracing on at 32.80 FPS on 1080p and 17.77 FPS on 1440p. Now comparing the results to the non-ray tracing versions, at 1080p there's a 50% decrease in performance, and at 1440p there is a 52% decrease in performance with ray tracing turned on. Now honestly, whilst looking great, the ray tracing was just too choppy for me. Turning down the ray tracing or graphics setting would improve and help with a more pleasing experience whilst in game. Hogwarts Legacy is up next with ray tracing on high settings, achieving 45.43 FPS on average at 1080p and 42.40 FPS on average at 1440p, making the 1080p ray tracing result 7% faster than the 1440p one. The 1% lows are again not great, being 23.87 FPS at 1080p and 20.57 at 1440p. My CPU is the likely culprit here in both the ray tracing and non-ray tracing results. Compared to the non-ray tracing results at 1080p, the non-ray tracing is 44% faster, and at 1440p, the non-ray tracing result is about 48% faster on average compared to when ray tracing is turned on. These results look quite similar in the non-ray trace results, both in the average frames and the 1% low average. Again, Hogwarts Legacy just doesn't play that nicely on my PC at the moment. Lastly, we have Ratchet and Clank A Rift Apart with ray tracing at very high. With ray tracing on at 1080p, we achieve 51.43 FPS compared to 40.97 FPS at 1440p, making the 1080p result 26% faster on average. The 1% lows at 1080p with 34.27 FPS, and at 1440p, 25.77 FPS on average, making the 1080p result 1% lows 33% better. At 1080p, the non-ray tracing result is 10% faster on average, and on 1440p, it's 42% faster on average compared to the ray tracing on results. The 1440p ray trace on result was not as nice due to the frame drops essentially whilst in combat scenes in my opinion. As well, on Ratchet and Clank A Rift Apart, I can't tell too much between the ray tracing on and the non-ray tracing in terms of image quality. Now for the overall comparisons. On the 13 game overall benchmark, with ray tracing off, 1080p performed about 6% faster overall compared to 1440p. Overwatch 2 has a quite significant deviation at 15%, so I believe there is some more testing that needs to be done here with better hardware. Overall, not a bad result for the RTX 3070 at being 6% faster on average at 1080p versus the 1440p benchmarks. Next is the ray tracing data on the 4-game average. At 1080p, it ends up being around about 36% faster than 1440p overall. Hogwarts Legacy is the only 7% difference compared to the other 3 titles being significantly higher. Again, I will need to look into redoing these benchmarks again at a later date. Now for pricing. On Newegg, there are currently 4 brand new listings for the RTX 3070, with its average price being $597.80 US, or $956.80 New Zealand dollars. In comparison, secondhand on a site called TradeMe, which is New Zealand's equivalent to eBay, from 10 listings, it averages around about $405.49 US dollars, or 649 New Zealand dollars. In comparison to the MSRP, of $499 USD. The second hand is around about $93.51 USD cheaper. The brand new Newegg listings are a no-go, well, due to the extremely high pricing for no reason whatsoever. Not the best pricing at the moment second hand in New Zealand, but it would be really great if this card was sub $312 US or 500 New Zealand dollars. Now in terms of the dollar cost per frame, second hand it would cost you $3.51 US dollar and $5.62 New Zealand dollars at 1080p, whereas at 1440p it would cost you $3.74 USD and $5.99 NZD per frame. For brand new at 1080p, it would be $5.17 USD and $8.28 NZD. At 1440p, it would be $5.52 USD and $8.83 NZD. Compared to the MSRP at 1080p, the second hand is cheaper by around about 81 cents US dollars, and at 1440p, it would be cheaper than the MSRP by around about 86 cents USD. While still a bit pricey at 1080p, if you snipe the cheap one second hand, you could get yourself one hell of a deal in terms of cost per frame. As you have noticed, the 1% lows are not the best on a few titles, which can show some stutter in the gameplay. In this case, the 3700X may not allow the RTX 3070 to perform to its maximum on stock settings. Whilst this could invalidate the RTX 3070 benchmarks, I think it's a great example of picking a CPU that allows you to take advantage of your GPU that you have installed. Further testing will need to be done in tuning the RAM in my system, as well as some sort of tuning on my 3700X as well. Stay tuned for a benchmarking the RTX 3070 once again with a comparison for the 3700X versus the R5 5600. This video will be coming out later. The RTX 3070 is more capable at 1080p, and some settings should be tweaked at 1440p to ensure a smoother experience. Ray tracing results were okay, at least at 1080p, but there is room for improvement. Although having 8GB of VRAM, the RTX 3070 could hold itself up pretty well in all of these 13 titles. If you can get it at a good price, such as sub 500 New Zealand dollars or sub 312 US dollars, then it could be a decent buy. Time is still to tell if the 8GB VRAM will be an inhibitor going forward, but with Plague Tale Requiem running at 99% usage and with a very high VRAM usage as well, and a few other titles at 1440p having 99% usage, I believe that the RTX 3070 most likely will not age exactly well into the future. Now 8GB of VRAM is definitely okay at the moment, and I think at this point you could probably consider it just an entry level point for gaming now. I don't think cards below that probably perform very well. I do have a 6GB 980 Ti, which I will benchmark later on. But to be honest with you, it probably is getting to a point where 8GB of VRAM is just you're gonna need to start there. It's nothing below that, especially in newer AAA titles that are to come out later. Personally, I would look for an RX 7800 XT or a cheaper 6950 XT if available. The RTX 3080 could also be a great second-hand option for a slight increase in VRAM. Now, I personally don't use ray tracing options in any case as much, and I would like to have a higher VRAM buffer for the future, but I have the RTX 3070 at the moment, so it's not really much of a choice. For cheaper options, the 6700 XT second-hand can be a great buy as well. I personally play esports titles such as League, Valorant, and sometimes Overwatch. I play Warframe as well on and off, but the VRAM hasn't really been an issue in any of the games I play. NVENC can also be helpful on the RTX 3070 for creators as well as DLSS going forward, especially considering that 8GB VRAM buffer that you have. DLSS might be a very good way to go for the future. Thanks for watching, and this was hopefully the first of many benchmarking videos that I make. Check out ystech.org for some more awesome content, but other than that, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.